So this is the model that New Economics Foundation came up with. They call it the house that Hayek built. That's referring to the economist Hayek, whose ideas have were taken up to form this system that's often called neoliberalism, that puts sort of competition and free markets and small states as its sort of real core ideas. And we've had essentially different variations of this system since the 1980s. Margaret Thatcher famously said that there is no alternative to this system, and subsequent governments, both in the UK and in most of the sort of wealthy nations, have largely agreed with that. But my suggestion is, in fact, there are alternatives. And in the sort of second part of tonight, we'll have a think about what we would want our alternative to be. And in the model, as you can see, there are these sort of different layers on top of each other, leading up to the outcomes, the kind of impact we actually see in the world around us, including environmental destruction. And that being built on sort of short-term priorities for government and society, and a sort of narrative that supports that. And a lot of the time, when we're trying to do work to make change, we really focus on this sort of top green section. And there's lots of really important work to be done there, sort of trying to alleviate the outcomes, trying to push for different priorities, sort of campaigning with our MPs for a particular bit of legislation, or signing a petition, that sort of thing, and sort of trying to change the narrative. People have done lots of work in the last 10, 20 years about changing the narrative to the idea that climate change is real, it's happening, and it's an urgent priority. But if we only focus on these top sections and don't do anything about some of these underlying sections that they're built on, the pillars of power that uphold those things, and then the principles and values and interests that those pillars of power are built on, the change that we see can often feel sort of frustratingly small or piecemeal or token. I mentioned about people doing lots of work to shift the narrative on climate change, and now sometimes we can get things like big banks having these great statements about how they're really conscious about the climate and want to make a difference, but still funding fossil fuels. And there was a big article today about how, since the Paris Climate Agreement, funding of fossil fuels from the major banks has still gone up in that time. And that's because these underlying power structures haven't been changed. And similarly, in terms of priorities, we've seen the Birmingham City Council, lots of other councils and organisations make a commitment to going net zero, which is really important. But again, progress can be really slow, and there's lots of competing interests and reasons why that doesn't then materialise into a clear action plan if we don't, again, try and tackle some of these underlying structures of power. Some of the ones that NEF have identified, obviously the government holds power, but also in our current system, corporations and finance wield a lot of power. We know that media, both old and new, hold a lot of power, and also academia, which is perhaps one that springs to my mind immediately. And is where perhaps it can really feel like, how can we possibly take on all of these sort of huge vested interests and make a difference? And I think part of the answer is there's work that can be done to directly challenge and try and change some of these, but it's also important to think about what's underlying those structures of power, what's holding those up. And what NEFA's identified is at the very bottom, thinking about whose interests all of this serves. So particularly the political and economic elites. Although, of course, there's always a sort of middle class that sort of does okay out of this system as well. And then values that serve those interests, and thinking about the difference between their actual values of competition, hierarchy, security, which are often talked about in terms of freedom and ambition and choice. And then from those values, the sort of principles, if values are more in the sort of realm of sort of beliefs and ideologies, the principles are a little bit more practical. Some of the key things that are held to be valuable in our system: the individual freedom, free markets, small government. And really, this whole system is very much built on the idea of keep repeating these principles as if they're universal, as if everybody subscribes to them, as if they are the universal good. And that leads to these pillars of power really thinking in those in terms of these principles informs how all of these institutions go about their business. That's their sort of fundamental basis for doing things, and in particular any sort of changes, even though they might have a sort of really clear benefit from our view, any changes that would really challenge any of these principles, that suddenly becomes an immediate barrier to making change. So, for example, if we talk about any sort of regulation that might limit the ability of corporations to cause pollution, or that might mean that consumers are not able to buy, I might limit the range of goods that consumers are able to buy because we've taken out environmentally damaging ones, or that involve the government taking a more active role in how companies organize themselves, how people live their lives. Any of those things will be really strongly challenged because they're going against these sort of core principles of the whole system.